Hi, this is Dr. Owen Anderson, and we're looking at part 10 of Hume's dialogues. We just finished part 9, in which Philo and Cleanthes claimed that the a priori or ontological argument fails. It's not compelling. And Demea now begins and replies, that's right. Each man somehow feels in his heart the truth of religion, which leads him to seek the protection of God, the being on whom all he and nature depend. It's not by reasoning. So even if the ontological argument is a sound argument, it's not by that kind of reasoning. Rather, his consciousness of his own weakness and misery. That's what brings us to religion. People are religious because of a sense of misery. Life is miserable. Even the best scenes of life are so troubling or so unpleasant that all our hopes and fears look to the future. We incessantly look forward and try through prayers, adoration, and sacrifice to appease those unknown powers we find by experience, right? So perhaps in the ancient days, the unknown powers were the spirit of the forest and the spirit of the stream and the spirit of fertility. And then we turn to the one who made all of those, who created everything. But it's the same thing. We're wretched creatures, he says. What help could there be for us amid the innumerable ills of life if religion didn't suggest some ways of reconciling ourselves with God? So that's the same thing. All religions are the same. One might look to the spirit of fertility, one might look to God, the creator, but they're doing it for the same reason, to escape suffering. And Philo says, yes, I'm indeed convinced that the best and the only method of bringing everyone to a proper sense of religion is by making them see clearly the misery and wickedness of men. So this is a key part. He's going to show that the world is filled with misery and wickedness, and respond to the various common objections that come up to that. Misery is the kind of suffering that comes on us that's not due to choices, right? Illnesses, natural disasters, unfairness of the birth lottery, all that stuff. Wickedness is what comes on us due to our own and others' immorality and the harms that it brings us. So for that purpose, a talent for eloquence and strong imagery is more needed than a talent for reasoning and argument. What need is there to prove something that everyone feels within himself? It's only necessary to make us feel it. So what you need to be in the media, if you're hired as a media exec to make an ad for a religion, you don't need a sound argument. You just need to be eloquent. My religion will really help you overcome suffering. Come to my religion and you'll have a happier life. You'll be blessed more. You'll be able to do #blessed on almost every single post. So that's what you need, not a sound argument. Indeed, replied Demea, the people are sufficiently convinced of this great and melancholy truth. The miseries of life, the unhappiness of man, the general corruptions of nature, the unsatisfactory enjoyment of pleasures, riches, honors, are all proverbial. So people complain about the rich not doing their fair share, but then they also say those pleasures that riches afford you are unsatisfactory, even if you had them. Well, it can't be both. Which one is it? I want money so I can enjoy my life, or even if I had money, that doesn't buy you happiness. On this point, said Philo, the learned are in perfect agreement with the common people, and in all literature, religions, and otherwise, the topic of human misery has been stressed with the most pathetic eloquence that sorrow and melancholy could inspire. Now, it's interesting because I think in this part, the next few parts, but this one is where it starts, Hume becomes more eloquent than he has so far. So far, it's been a somewhat dry analysis of arguments put into a fictional dialogue, but nothing remarkable about the dialogue structure itself from a literary perspective. But now he does become much more eloquent here in the section where he says, What matters is not arguments, but eloquence. And I think there's some brilliant lines in the next couple parts. So this is worth, if you read it before, read it again and take time to enjoy the composition of these parts. The works of the poets whose testimony has extra authority because they speak from feeling without a system abound in images of this sort. The difficulty of the world, the pain of life. From Homer down to Dr. Edward Young, the whole inspired tribe of poets has always been aware that if they are to present human life in a way that fits with each individual person, sees it and feels it as being like, they'll have to present it that way in terms of the suffering. So the poets are the sensitive souls, the most sensitive among us, and that's what you want. Like if you had a radar to detect enemy missiles, do you want a dull radar or a sensitive radar? Well, you want a really sensitive one, right? So you want the sensitive persons to tell us what it's like. That's what the poets do. And what they tell us is the world's filled with misery. As for authorities, replied Demea, you needn't hunt for them. Look around any library. I venture to guess that, except for authors of particular sciences, such as chemistry or botany, who have no occasion to treat of human life, almost every one of those innumerable writers has somewhere or other been led by a sense of human misery to testify to it and complain of it. That's what books are about. In some way, shape, or form. That's what a narrative is about, suffering. That's how you relate to it. If a narrative was about a person who had never suffered and just went from more money to more money to more money and had no suffering in that, well, you might envy them, but you might want to keep up with them, but there's no relation in terms of the human condition. Now, Leibniz, the philosopher Leibniz said, this is the best of all possible worlds. Because God is perfect in goodness, this is the best of all possible worlds. He is perhaps the first who ventured such a bold and paradoxical opinion. Given that he was the first, replied Demea, mightn't that very fact have made him realize he was wrong? For is this a subject on which philosophers can claim to make discoveries, especially this late in history? I mean, the discoveries of philosophy have mostly been done this late in history. And this is 300 years ago, roughly, a little less. And can any man hope by a simple denial to outweigh the united testimony of mankind? So you need more than just referencing Leibniz. Why should man claim to be exempt from the fate of all the other animals? So here he goes into, he's going to show now how the world's filled with misery. Starting with nature. Nature versus nature. The whole earth, believe me, Philo, is cursed and polluted. A perpetual war among all of its creatures. Need, hunger, and deprivation stimulate the strong and courageous. Fear, anxiety, and terror agitate the weak and infirm. Feel the eloquence? So let's say, no, I love to go out into nature. These people who do, what's it called, glamping? And you have like a trailer with a 56-inch television, a heater, an air conditioner, and you go into nature and watch the football game with your freezer in the trailer with beverages. And say, I love going into nature. Well, that's not really going to nature. Well, I like looking, I was up in the northern Rocky Mountains this summer, gazing out from a 12,000-foot peak at all the rest of what lay before me. Beautiful. Well, if you were actually to get into a botanical or zoological description, what you would see is misery. You'd see the hungry grizzly bear looking for something to devour. And that thing that could be devoured, spending its day in terror of a cougar or a grizzly bear, right? That's what's actually out there. You see bugs feeding on each other's carcasses, 1,000 ants crawling on a cricket and devouring it to death. That's what you actually see in nature. And the first entrance into life brings distress to the newborn infant and its wretched mother. What's the first thing an infant does? Yes! I made it. I'm here. This is terrible. And we can try to make it feel better. Well, they're just exercising their lungs. We can exercise your lungs by saying, yeah, right? Be super excited you're alive. No, instead, and the mother, what a difficult thing to go through, right? That's why mothers laugh when guys get sick. They get a cold, like, oh, I'm so sick, I can't do anything. Weakness, impotence, and distress accompany each stage of life. As you go from infancy to toddler to teenager to young adult to senior. Weakness, you're impotent. You have distresses. I guarantee if I was to just go around campus and ask people, they could list me 10 stresses they have in life. Why their life is very hard. And then it eventually reaches its end in agony and horror. That's what's ahead of you. Agony, it takes a couple decades. Your body over a few decades breaks down and you go through great suffering. And you're going to doctors all the time, trying to get it to just hold together a little longer. Was that Apollo 13? They had to like use duct tape on parts of it as they re-entered the atmosphere. You're doing that with your body, right? So you don't burn up into non-existence, just holding it together. But you'll eventually end in agony and horror. Your best friend at the end will be what? Starts with an O, ends with PM. Opium. You might call it morphine. But at the end of life, that's what you're going to be begging for, in agony. So you don't have to live out the last few moments in pain. Well, that's depressing. Remember I said problem of evil is depressing? And it's depressing because he's not wrong. Observe too, says Philo, nature's intricate devices for embittering the life of every living being. Right? So it's not just nature versus nature, it's that nature's designed to make life bitter. The stronger prey on the weaker and keep them in perpetual terror. I mean, do you ever watch rabbits? I have a lot of cottontails around where I live. And their day is just spent in terror, running from bush to bush, nibbling a little bit here, keeping an eye out, run to the next one, nibble a little bit, keep an eye out. What kind of life is that? And the weaker, in their turn, prey on the stronger to vex and trouble them, giving them no respite. Think of the innumerable race of insects that either are bred on the body of an animal or flying about, put their stings into him. So you might say, I just wish I was a really big animal. Well, then you got the little fly that bites your butt and lays its eggs in your eyeball so that your eye slowly grows maggots that eat on it and then fester and fly away. So that's no good being bigger. Thus, on every hand, before and behind, above and below, every animal is surrounded by enemies that constantly seek his misery and destruction. Well, that doesn't sound very good. That doesn't sound like a designed world, does it? Remember, that was what we've been looking at so far, is mostly the design argument. And now we're into saying, not only according to Philo, does the design argument not hold together? The world's the opposite of having good order and being well designed. It's full of misery and destruction. And Demea says, yeah, man alone seems to be a partial exception because we can use our mind to master the others. Like you thought this was from a movie, right? No, that was a quote from Hume. Lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. Well, there they are. In Hume. On the contrary, says Philo, this is now, we have nature versus nature versus man, but we're also going to have man versus man. It is just here that we see how clearly uniform and equal nature's maxims are. It is true that man can, by combining, surmount all his real enemies and become master of the whole animal kingdom, but doesn't he immediately conjure up imaginary enemies, the demons of his imagination, who haunt him with superstitious terrors and blast every enjoyment of life. Right? You come up with all these imaginary things to be afraid of, be terrified of. Even his sleep and dreams bring him new materials for anxious fear and death. His refuge from every other evil presents only the dread of endless and innumerable woes. So in life, you're anxious, and about death, you're anxious. There's no hiding from it. Remember Hamlet. There's no place to go where you'll be at peace, except for to just stop thinking, which is a kind of death. Try to stop existing. The wolf's attack on the timid flock is no worse than what superstition does to the ancients' feeling of wretched animals. So here's a kind of attack on religion. If you don't look at it closely, you won't see it. Superstition as religion, a wolf in sheep's clothing. You'll have these religious leaders who peddle superstition to their followers, and it's just like a wolf eating the sheep. The followers are terrified, and they'll be told some superstitious things. If you don't appease this deity or live with this spirit of nature, you'll have a miserable life. And the people say, please take this money and do a performance ritual for me to give me safety. And man is miserable. Animals don't have to suffer that, do they? There aren't any superstitious religions among the animals. Besides, Demea, think about this very society through which we get the upper hand over the wild beasts, our natural enemies. What new enemies do we create? Because someone could say, yeah, in a state of nature, things are really bad. So we create society to protect us from the state of nature. But by creating society, what new enemies have we raised up? Oppression, injustice, contempt, disrespect, violence, sedition, war, slander, treachery, fraud. Men use these to torment one another. And they would soon dissolve the society they had formed if they weren't afraid that even greater ills would come from their doing so. So we're stuck in society. We're oppressed by others. Most of today's social dialogue is about this stuff, right? Oppression, injustice, contempt, disrespect, violence is now what's on people's minds. And that's because you lived in society instead of nature. But if you just go back to nature, then you have bears eating you. There's nothing you can do about a grizzly bear. Can't outrun it, outclimb it, outswim it. These external injuries, said Demea, that we suffer from animals, from men, and from all the elements do indeed form a frightful catalog of woes, but they're nothing in comparison to the ones that arise from within ourselves, from the illness, mental illness of mind and body. And that's another topic people talk about today, right? Mental illness. Well, here he is. Illness of our mind. How many people lie under the lingering torment of disease? How pathetic a list by the great poet from Milton. Intestine stone and ulcer, colic pangs, demoniac frenzy, moping melancholy, and moonstruck madness, pining atrophy, marasmus, and wide-wasting pestilence. Dire was the tossing, deep the groans, despair tended the sick, busiest from couch to couch, and over them triumphant death. His dart shook, but delayed to strike, though often invoked with vows as their chief good and final hope. Begging for death to get out of this list of things, but he waits, he lets you suffer for a while first. And the disorders of the mind, we call now mental illness, though they are more secret because we may not know about each other's struggles, may be no less dismal and vexatious. Remorse, shame, anguish, rage, disappointment, anxiety, fear, dejection, despair. Who's ever passed through life without cruel attacks from these tormentors? Many people have scarcely ever felt anything other than those. Labor and poverty, so hated by everyone, are the certain fate of the majority. And the privileged few who enjoy leisure and wealth never reach actual contentment and happiness. All the goods of life put together would not make us very happy, but all the ills taken together would make us wretched indeed. So if you got all the best things that life can offer, you still wouldn't be happy. But even just a few of the ills, let alone all of them, will make your life miserable. Life can indeed be made unsatisfactory by almost any one ill, but it's not improved by any one benefit. Now, if an alien, another time he's talking about aliens here, suddenly came to this world, and I showed him, as a specimen of ills, a hospital full of diseases, or a prison crowded with criminals and debtors, a field of battle with corpses all over it, a fleet of ships sinking in the ocean, a nation suffering under tyranny, famine, and plague. If you go from those things to the cheerful side of life, where would you take him? To a ball, an opera, a court? He might reasonably think that those were only showing him other kinds of distress and sorrow. So there's no way to escape such striking instances, said Philo, except by explaining them away. And that makes them, the indictment, even more severe. Because someone could say, well, you're just focusing on the bad side. Now, notice the bad side's everything. And the hardness of heart in a person who says, you're just focusing on the bad side, I'm not going to look at that, is part of the bad side. That there could be hardness of heart like that. Or that they just complain because they're predisposed to be discontent. And the reply is, well, what greater guarantee of misery could there be but to have a wretched temperament? Some people are born into the world with a wretched temperament, and that's part of why the world's filled with misery. That's part of the proof of it. Why would you be born with that? They're not satisfied with life, and they're afraid of death. This is the secret chain that holds us. That's from Milton, but that's also Hamlet. So it's only a false delicacy, which a few refined spirits permit themselves, and which has spread these complaints among the whole human race. Someone could say, yeah, that's only just from these people who are more sensitive, and they give complaints, and then they spread their discontent around. But isn't that really just a greater awareness? That's the poets. A greater awareness of the pleasures and pains of life, and that the pleasures don't come close to outweighing the pains. Leisure doesn't help us because it makes us anxious and slack. Not that it would do me good to give up leisure, for activity and ambition bring disappointment, vexation, and trouble. So either way, you have problems. Now, Cleanthes says, I can see what you're describing in others, but I don't see much of that, little or nothing of that in myself. I'm an island of bliss in a sea of misery. Well, if you don't feel human misery yourself, I congratulate you on your happy uniqueness. Others, seemingly the most prosperous, haven't been ashamed to give voice to their complaints in the saddest tones. He mentions Emperor Charles V, who retired early to have Philip II, his son, reign, and so he could enjoy all the riches of the empire, not have to work as emperor, immediately regretted it. And in his last speech he said, the greatest prosperities he had ever enjoyed had been mixed with so much adversity that he could truly say he'd never enjoyed any satisfaction or contentment. One of the best situations in human history. And he can tell you from firsthand experience, it didn't bring contentment. And yet the great majority of people spend their lives trying to get close to that. And he's saying, even if you got here, you'd be unsatisfied. And Cicero's fortune was similar. Or Cato. Ask anyone you know whether they would be willing to live again the last 10 years, and their answer would be no. Human misery is so great. What we hope for is the next 10 will be better. But we wouldn't want to relive the last 10. If you had to have those two choices, live the next 10 or relive the last 10, you'd pick, I'm hoping it'll get better in the future. So is it possible, Cleanthes said Philo, that after all these reflections and countless others that might be suggested, you still stick to your anthropomorphisms and assert the moral attributes of God, his justice, benevolence, mercy, and uprightness? That these are the same nature as these vices or virtues in human creatures. We grant that his power is infinite. Whatever he wills to happen does happen, but neither man nor any other animal is happy. Therefore, God doesn't will their happiness. His knowledge is infinite. He is never mistaken in his choice of means or to any end, but the course of nature doesn't lead to human or animal happiness. Therefore, nature isn't established for that purpose. Through the whole range of human knowledge, there are no inferences more certain and infallible than these. So even if God exists, he doesn't seem to care about our happiness, because if he did, we'd be happy, and we're not. So now we're getting to the problem of evil, which comes in the next paragraph. What we've done up till now, what this section has done, is shown the world is filled with misery and wickedness and handled objections to that. So we're entering the problem of evil with that as a fixed point. The world is indeed filled with misery and wickedness. And if that's so, how can we say God is real?